And we're going to try again. I'm going to have a little bit of a different approach in order to try to achieve this rededicated life. So um, we'll see how it goes. So if you would turn in Zephaniah or turn to your copy of God's word to Zephaniah. Zephaniah is after Habakkuk, and this is in the book that we call the 12. So there's one book which consists of 12 smaller books, and in the Hebrew Bible it is called the 12. And there's an intention to the order of the book of the 12, and you may remember at the conclusion of the book of Habakkuk, or for those of you with British pronunciations, Habakkuk. Habakkuk is, in one sense, he is responding the way the remnant, the faithful, will respond to God in the midst of judgment. And we're able to see in verses 17 and 19 that response. Though the fig tree should not blossom and there be no produce on the vines, though the yield of the olive should fail and the fields yield no food, though the flock should be cut off from the fold and there be no cattle in the stalls. So is that good times or bad? It's really, really bad. Yet, verse 18, I will exult in Yahweh, I will rejoice in the God of my salvation. Yahweh, the Lord, is my strength, and he has set my feet like hinds' feet and makes me tread on my high places. And this is the conclusion, in one sense, to what God reveals to Habakkuk, because Habakkuk asked this question: how long, O Lord? And especially his accent is, how, O Lord? Because what he saw both within Judah was unrighteous leaders, and then when God brought a more unrighteous instrument to be the judgment of the unrighteous leaders within Judah, the question for Habakkuk is, how, Lord, do you use sinful people according to your covenant promises? So we could maybe phrase that Habakkuk really was asking a question similar to, as Tim taught Job, as Job asked, and it's this problem of how is God just when, one, he does permit evil to go on, and then how is God just even when he uses evil people to be the instruments of punishment? And then the answer to the question, in one sense, gets sustained attention in Zephaniah, because Zephaniah just goes on and on and on about one thing: the day of the Lord. Because the day of the Lord is going to emphasize God will come in judgment. But we find after the day of the Lord, really it's a part of the day of the Lord, after God does bring judgment, he will save his people. And we'll see in Zephaniah that the salvation is going to also mirror the judgment in the day of the Lord. And this is the way it will mirror. God will see in the day of the Lord judges all nations. So for my favorite students, who that mainly depends upon your age. So there's prejudice here. I am biased to young students. All right. So, young students, in the Bible, we can think of peoples in two main categories. What are the two main categories that the Bible divides all people into? You are either this or you are that. You want multiple choice? Okay. You are either A, Gentile or Jew, or this is choice B, you are either American or non-American. Hey, correct, right? In the Bible, everything is really hinging upon how do you relate to Abraham. Now that we're seeing in Genesis that itself has its own significant history. And that's because God chose Abraham. God made covenant promises to Abraham. And Abraham's descendants are a part of those covenant promises. Those descendants are brought up out of Egypt, and God makes a covenant with them through Moses at Sinai, and they enter into a covenant as a nation, and now God is working with them. And everybody else who's not a part of that nation of Israel, these ethnic offspring of Abraham, they're Gentiles. Now there could be, 100,000 types of Gentiles, but you're still all Gentiles. And there is only the offspring of Abraham who are a part of the nation of Israel. In Zephaniah, we're going to see the day of the Lord is going to say both Jews and Gentiles will be judged, and both Jews and Gentiles will be saved. The day of the Lord reveals that God is going to judge both and God is going to save both. Not that all of those two groups will be saved, but from both of those groups, God will save his people. So let's take a look at the day of the Lord as we go into Zephaniah. I want to give you a division of the chapter or the chapters. Whether you think it's helpful or not, I do find that it can be helpful for you to have a big picture of how things are working in a book of the Bible, because sometimes, at least for me, it can be easy to lose my way. The first part of the book of Zephaniah is God's announcement of judgment. And so we could say it's about the day of the Lord, namely about God's announcement of his judgment against the nations. This starts in verse 2 of chapter 1 and goes through verse 8 of chapter 3. So this is the most sustained subject in the day of the Lord, that is the judgment of the nations. But the second part starts in chapter 3, verse 9. And it goes through verse 20, the end of the book. And this is God announces the salvation of the nations. So I like that. It's able to have like one clear subject for the majority. And then we're able to see in verse 9, for the rest of the book, we're going to give attention to God's salvation of his people. Now, there are a few things that we do need to realize, and I'm just going to ask students that you look up at me. These are sometimes things that you need to listen and get, maybe more than write down and you can keep up with. So listen and make sure you get this. We're going to see that the reason God brings this judgment is because of Israel's sin, which in one sense, it's always the case. Why does God judge people? Because of sin. God judges people because they break his law. So this will be the basis, and we'll see some of the details of the sin accented in Judah, but that will be the basis. Now, what is important, and this is where there can be another lesson that's helpful for us, this lesson is made very clear in the day of the Lord amid a theater of the geopolitical sort of rising and falling of nations. And in that sense, we can see even in the last, how many days is this? When did this start? Friday? So I'm paying great attention to the news. And I'm thinking about all of the nations that are involved and all the actions that they are militarily taking. And I'm thinking about our own nation and about borders. And in that sense, we can recognize, well, the reason that this nation is falling and the reason that this nation is rising is because they're more powerful than the other one. Right? That's not what Zephaniah reveals. Now, there are clearly world powers that are rising and falling, and like Habakkuk, it seems that Zephaniah, he ministered in the period either just before Josiah took over as the king of Judah, or maybe even overlapped with the beginning of Josiah. And so what you would place that at is that there's this changing in the world power, that no longer are the Assyrians going to be the rulers, but the Babylonians are going to emerge. You also have questions about Egypt. Are they going to now have a place? And so it's in this period, as the Babylonians are going to emerge as sort of the world dominant force, that Zephaniah gives this message, but he's giving it to Judah. He's at least making it known in Jerusalem. But the explanation that he's going to give for why God is going to judge all nations and you, Israel, as well as why God is going to save from all nations and you, Israel, it's not because they had air supremacy or whatever the version of air supremacy was in their day. It was because of sin. And here's another really important lesson. Israel had this choice. If they were going to have peace, and if they were going to know what God had promised to them in that covenant that he made with them at Sinai through Moses, then there was only one sort of geopolitical strategy that they needed to be devoted to. And that would be that they were going to entrust their life and their destiny to their God. And so they would worship him according to his commandments, and they would obey him. That would be, in one sense, the national policy of Israel if they wanted to trust God and experience his victory in relationship to all the nations that are around them. So I'm just going to say whatever the implications are, and I do think we're going to see some as you try to reckon with even the still present ethnic people and now nation state of Israel, we're still going to be wrestling with this same question. They clearly failed, and Zephaniah will make that known, but yet God is going to point to the day of the Lord, which will show that yet God in the future will save them. And I'm going to give you reasons that I think Zephaniah makes every Christian have to wrestle with Old Testament prophecies. And what do we deal with them for the present and the future? And you'll just have to wrestle with them. I'll tell you what my conclusions, which are probably more general than some of my fellow teachers in the church. Here's what we found out. Israel, though they should have trusted their life and destiny to God and thus worshiped and obeyed him, they didn't, which in fact is the normal course for Israel. They failed, and the particular nature of their sin is highlighted. Look at verses 4, 5, and 6 in chapter 2. Here is a statement of God's universal and total judgment. That is stated in verses 2 and 3. And you see, in one sense, it's like a mirror version or a parallel version of creation, except in this case, it's destruction. So in the same way God made everything, now God is going to destroy everything. And we see why, and look at verse 4. So I will stretch out my hand against Judah, against the inhabitants of Jerusalem. I will cut off the remnant of Baal from this place, and the names of the idolatrous priests, along with the priests, and those who worship on the housetops, the host of heaven, and those who worship and swear to Yahweh, and yet swear by Milcom, and those who have turned back from following Yahweh, and those who have not sought Yahweh or inquired of him. So what is the reason for God's judgment that is going to come? Idolatry. Idolatry. This does help too. So students, youngest students, but not only you. Do you know you were made to worship God? Your whole life, everything about you, all your abilities, God gave them to you. And he made them so that you will use them to worship him. And when you worship anyone or anything with any of your abilities, gifts, and talents, in the way that you should worship God, but you don't. You worship someone else, something else, which normally is not because you found a secret temple that you could bow down to or offer an animal to, but rather because you fear someone, because you want them to like you more than you desire God to be pleased. Normally, we see it related to fears and loves, which also we could say that normally shows up in our wants. And when we fear someone in the way that we should only fear God, when we love someone in a way that we should only love God, when we desire someone in a way that we should only desire God and what he wants, then we have sinned. And we might think like, that's not a big deal, is it? Nobody got hurt. Well, when we read in Zephaniah how God responds to that, and we see of this total and universal judgment for idolatry, that teaches us something about our sin of idolatry. It's a really big deal to God. And so that's the basis for this. So I don't think Zephaniah is saying because there was a larger political sort of milieu that brought this upon. I think it's because of Israel's sin, Judah's sin. And so we go forth reading about the judgment on the basis of Israel's sin. Now, what's interesting, and we can't really say anything definitively, but what is interesting is if you wanted to kind of ping pong back and forth, here's some chapters you could read. 2 Kings chapter 21, verses 10 through 15, 2 Chronicles chapter 33. You would be able to see that there are events around this particular time period in Judah when you have Hezekiah, and then you have his wicked son Manasseh. And Manasseh was wicked, really, really wicked, and sort of reversed some of the good that his father had done. But then Manasseh gets taken to exile, then he gets taken back, and then he seems to have reformed. And he starts to do good. And then that reform doesn't last. And then Amon comes along in his place, and the idolatry returns. And so what we're able to see is it's a bit strange when you're just trying to put it into sort of historical place. But we can't say definitively because Zephaniah doesn't explicitly tell us when it was that he was ministering this message in Judah. But I'm going to just tell you what I think. I think it's somewhere around, we'll say like 640 to 630, like somewhere in that decade. It could be a little earlier. I'm sorry, it could be a little later and a little closer to Josiah. But nonetheless, this is what is happening. And there, what we're able to read is that indeed Judah is incredibly idolatrous. And whatever kind of like brief spark of turning away from idolatry, it is at best partial. And this is when Zephaniah is making this, which again is emphasizing all of the geopolitics is not what this day of the Lord is a response to. It is the day of the Lord, which is a response to sin. And so Zephaniah gives this message. Now, the message I'm going to just give attention to for the rest of our time, and that is we need to think about the judgment of the day of the Lord, and we need to think about the salvation of the day of the Lord. So if you're gonna think, what is Zephaniah teaching me about? Zephaniah is teaching you about God's promised judgment and God's promised salvation, both of which they sort of make up the day of the Lord. And it's because of details on the day of the Lord that some people they say, no, this couldn't have happened, when Zephaniah historically is said to have given this message, because he says things that seem like that couldn't be said. And one of the things that we'll find is some things will clearly have a fulfillment that is nearer to Zephaniah when he said these words. And then other things they're not. They're going to have a very far away fulfillment. And this is going to help us fill in when we read about the details of Zephaniah's day of the Lord. Zephaniah is not interested in saying, when is this going to happen? Or even differently than we saw Habakkuk, Zephaniah doesn't even say, by whom is this going to happen? You don't really have any hints as to what particular nation might God use to bring this about. Zephaniah is really giving attention to what is going to be a part of the day of the Lord. And when we put this together, I think we do need to understand that Zephaniah gives to us a composite portrait, if you will, of the day of the Lord that is going to have multiple fulfillments along a timeline that when we begin to plot the ones that we can find on the timeline, we will see there are large gaps between those fulfillments. Does that make sense? Let's think of it this way, favorite students. All right. If your mom or dad say, it's your birthday. My wife had a birthday yesterday, so this is an easier illustration for me. Right? That's the day, right? It's your birthday. And on your birthday, there has been sort of an announcement. We are going to celebrate. We're going to have banners up. We're going to have a special meal. We're going to give gifts. We're going to dance. We are going to have cake. Right? What are you expecting to be the fulfillment on this day that we call your birthday? Is it some of those things or all of those things? All of those things. But when you walk downstairs, you're able to see, whoa, there's the banners. So at 7 a.m., you got the fulfillment of the promise of the banners that say happy birthday you saw those were hung up. And then you have to go through with your normal duties and stuff. So there's like a long gap between like the start of the day and then the end of the day. And at the end of the day, we're like, special meal. And what does everybody do for special birthdays? You go eat Mexican food, right? So you go and you get you go and eat Mexican food and you're eating chips. And what, of course, are you going to have done? You're going to get the big sombrero and it will be put on your hat and on your head, and then we'll sing and eat fried ice cream, right? Don't you do that? But when you were tracking those, was there a lot of time between the banner and the special meal? Yes, there's about 12 hours. And then you have to go, and then you go home, which is like another 30 minutes. And then you now have cake. And then you eat the cake. But then after the cake, you do the dancing. See, if you were to plot that on the timeline of your day, there'd be fulfillment, and there'd be a space of time where there's nothing happening. Doesn't feel like it's your birthday. And then there'd be fulfillment up there. That promise is fulfilled. And then the next day, when you wake up and you think back about your birthday, are you able to say, you know what? On my birthday, there was banners, and there was a special meal, and there was chocolate cake, and there was dancing, and there was sombreros. And all of that would be a part of your birthday. Right? The day of the Lord is like that in Zephaniah. And so I'll give you some people who have fancier ways of explaining it, Old Testament scholars. They say the key to understanding Zephaniah in the day of the Lord description is because the terms are broken. I'm sorry, the terms are composite and they're broken down into constituent parts, just like banner, special meal, birthday cake. Another scholar commented, it is in this comprehensive character of this prophecy that we find the reason why Zephaniah neither names nor minutely describes the executors of the judgment upon Judah. He does not predict either this or that particular judgment, but extends and completes in comprehensive generality the judgment by which God maintains his kingdom on the earth. So a key to being able to understand Zephaniah is to observe that this book tells us what will happen, but it does not tell us when it will happen or by whom it will happen. So I think we learn from Zephaniah things like verse 13 of chapter 2. And he will stretch out his hand against the north and cause Assyria to perish, and he will make Nineveh a desolation, parched like the wilderness. So who does he say is going to be destroyed? Assyria, and the capital of Assyria is Nineveh. And did that happen? In about 100 years, that happened. So that is a part of the day of the Lord through Zephaniah's prophecy that happened very near, but yet we'll be able to look at some others and be able to say, well, that did not happen as it did. Here's another. Let's go back. Look at verses 2 and 3, chapter 1. I will completely end all things. From the face of the ground, declares Yahweh, I will end man and beast. I will end the birds of the sky and the fish of the sea and the ruins along with the wicked, and I will cut off man from the face of the ground, declares Yahweh. Okay, as it is written, has that happened? That didn't happen in Zephaniah's day, didn't happen in the generation that followed Zephaniah's day, and the fact that me and you are here right now illustrates that it's not happened yet. Right, so what we have here is that some things they did find fulfillment in the near future relative to Zephaniah, and other things that have a distant and even still distant fulfillment. Another passage that we need to give some consideration to is in chapter 3, verses 18 to 20. Notice that he says at the end of verse 18 that he is going to assemble those who grieve about the appointed feast. They were from you, O Zion. The reproach of exile is a burden to them. Behold, I'm going to deal at that time with those who afflict you, and I will save the lame and gather the banished, and I will turn them in their shame into praise and a name in all the earth. Right? The hiccup there is he's referring with exile language, but Zephaniah wasn't a part of an exile. And so some people are thinking, okay, well, this must have been written later because this wasn't what happened for Zephaniah. How's he referring to this? And I think it's because Zephaniah lives close enough to when the exile did happen, is that when the book was being compiled from the Message, it could be that the composition of the book of Zephaniah, which is also a part of the inspiration of Scripture, that process includes the composition of the book, that they used some of this vocabulary that was a future reality of the exile and the eventual return. But here we're clearly able to see that in the day of the Lord, Zephaniah is talking about God's universal judgment. We'll be able to just look at a few of them. All right, we've already seen in verses 4 through 6 that his judgment is against Judah and Jerusalem. Right, we're able to see that the day of the Lord continues, and he's also accenting that Israel is going to suffer in the day of the Lord. So we're able to see in verses 7 through 13, Israel is going to suffer in the day of the Lord. We then are able to see there's a hope, a word of hope to the remnant, Jerry. Clear teaching of the remnant in chapter 2. Gather yourselves together indeed, O nations, without shame, before the decree takes effect. The day passes like chaff before the burning anger of Yahweh comes upon you. Before the day of Yahweh's anger comes upon you, seek Yahweh, all you humble of the earth who have worked his justice. Seek righteousness, seek humility. Perhaps you will be hidden in the day of Yahweh's anger. And so even when there is a message to God's, we could call them the believer within Israel, though Judah is dominated by idolatry and injustice, there still is a message of, to the believer, just like Habakkuk, how should you live? Or to say it, Jerry, how did the remnant live? They worshiped Yahweh and they kept his commands. They trusted him because there was, even with Yahweh, who is rich in mercy, maybe he changes. Maybe he relents, humanly speaking, and holds back on his judgment. That is a brief message of, there were real believers in Israel during this time. It's just that they were few. And so here, or at least they were few compared to the whole. And so he gives a message to the remnants. And then what follows is he now is giving judgment in this announcement of God's day of the Lord to the nations. And so in verses 4-7, you see the Philistines. They are told God is going to judge them. In verses 8-11, Moab is told God is going to judge them. When you look at verse 12, you see Cush, or the Ethiopians, which would have been Egypt. God is going to judge them. And then the Assyrians were going to receive God's judgment in verses 13, 14, and 15. Now, students, the Philistines, the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Cushites, the Assyrians, are they enemies of God's people or allies of God's people? Did they bless Abraham and his offspring, or did they curse him? They cursed him. Right? So when we remember the question, God is, how is it that you are letting injustice or evil happen? Zephaniah's prophecy is, oh, he's not letting it happen. He is going to come and he is going to judge them. And these are specific, detailed prophecies of how God is going to bring these judgments to pass in the day of the Lord. But this is interesting. Notice what it says at the end of verse 9. All right, he says what God is going to do to Moab and the Ammonites is they're going to become like Sodom and Gomorrah, which is, okay, are you sort of destroyed or are you completely destroyed? He totally wipes you out. And yet, notice what it says, but he also says, the remnant of my people will plunder them, and the remainder of my nation will inherit them. Right? We'll see that this is going to develop further. Right? God's day of the Lord, or the day of the Lord, is going to be a judgment against Israel, Judah, as well as the nations. Some of it came immediately, like Nineveh, or not immediately, but within 100 years. Others of it did not find fulfillment in even what I think is the time of the Old Testament, but extends into the period of the gospel, the first and second advent of Christ. But then when we come into chapter 3, we now hear again the day of God's judgment against Jerusalem. And so he cries out of his judgment to Jerusalem and pronounces woe. And again, this is the vindication of Yahweh doing righteousness. Look at verse 5. Yahweh is righteous in her midst. He will do no injustice. Every morning he brings his justice to light. He does not fail. But the unjust knows no shame. In this sense, we're able to see the hope of God's remnant as he either waits for or experiences with them God's justice. What is the present form of hope? It is the future visitation of God's justice. So, believer, does the New Testament continue to give you counsel like this? Vengeance is mine, thus saith the Lord. Therefore, what are you not to do? You cannot repay evil for evil. Right? In the same way, the kind of the encouragement or the hope for the remnant who is going to have to wait for God to do this is that you do know God will bring his justice in judgment against his enemies, whether they are within Judah or whether they are the nations outside of Judah. That is the present hope of God's people. They have a future-oriented trust. God is going to come and visit his enemies in judgment. That judgment of Jerusalem continues all the way through verse 7. And in verse 8, we now turn the corner and see that the day of the Lord also announces God's salvation. God's salvation. It begins where we are able to see who's going to be included. Therefore, wait for me, declares Yahweh, for the day when I rise up as a witness. Indeed, my judgment is to assemble nations, to gather kingdoms, to pour out on them my indignation, all my burning anger, for all the earth will be devoured by the fire of my zeal. For then I will change them to peoples with purified lips, that all of them may call on the name of Yahweh to serve him shoulder to shoulder. Who is he referring to? Who is he referring to that he's going to change? He's going to change them. Their lips have been purified like Isaiah. They're going to call on the name of the Lord. Which people? Remember our two categories. Which people? Jew or Gentile? What was said in verse 8? Who is he talking about? Jew or Gentile? Gentiles. Gentiles. And then we're able to see Gentiles are said they're going to be the ones that God is going to change them to those with purified lips who call on the name of the Lord and serve him. And then he begins to name them. Just like he named them in judgment, he begins to highlight them. And so God's judgment brings salvation, not only of Israel, but also of the nations. And Zephaniah is very clear that while Yahweh was the instrument behind whatever judgment would come in a temporal fashion, Yahweh is also the instrument that brings salvation from these same peoples. In chapter 2, verse 11, we are able to see that Gentile conversion indeed is a part of this day of the Lord, as well as what we just read in verse 9 of chapter 3. Now we see in verse 7 of chapter 2 that there was a remnant, and it would be through this remnant that God is going to continue to sustain them. And eventually, God would be able to bring salvation to Judah, and he would restore her fortunes. Look at verse 20 at the end of chapter 3. At that time, I will bring you in, even at the time when I gather you together. Indeed, I will give you to be a name. I will give you to be a name and praise among all the peoples of the earth when I restore your fortunes before your eyes, says Yahweh. And when you go back, the context there, that's Zion. Here, what we're able to see is that the salvation in the day of the Lord that follows the judgment is going to include all nations, and it's going to include the descendants of Abraham, the very people, in one sense, we could say people, but the people who come from the nation that we call Israel. And so this is the hope of the remnant. This is the hope of the remnant. The day of the Lord is the hope of one, God vindicating himself as just, but it also is the hope of God mercifully saving those whom he has covenanted to save but it doesn't just include Abraham's descendants. It includes those from the nations as well. Now, this develops a tension, right? Again, what was the basis of all of the judgment that we've seen the day of the Lord address?
Idolatry.
Whose idolatry?
Israel's
idolatry, centered in Jerusalem. And so that's why God brings this judgment. And so in one sense, it ends with who therefore is becoming the one that is going to be a name that is going to be praised among all the peoples of the earth. It's also it's Judah. So if you think about it for a little bit, there's a bit of a tension here that's necessary for us to understand. God's judgment came because God's people were not like God. They were idolaters and they were unjust. They did not worship him nor obey him. And so God's judgment came. And yet when God's judgment is complete and salvation is brought forth, who is in one sense going to have an accented benefit of God's blessing? From Zephaniah chapter 3. The daughter of Zion, sing for joy, verse 14. Make a loud shout, O Israel. Be glad and exult with all your heart, O daughter of Jerusalem. All the nations are going to come in, and as we see, they are going to, in that sense, they're going to be like them in that they have been saved by God into his people, but there is still a distinction between them. And yet, God's people were, in one sense, they were the catalyst for the judgment in the beginning. And now, in the end, when God's brought salvation, they still have this accented place along with those saved from the nations, to which someone may say, why would that be the case? Like, shouldn't they have a lower place? To say it another way, wouldn't you think in the day of the Lord bringing about this ultimate salvation that you would place maybe the nations in a different relationship, and maybe Judah and Jerusalem and Israel, maybe they'd be given the bottom? Well, it makes sense to me. They're the more disobedient ones who brought this upon this day of the Lord judgment upon all the world. Maybe they should have a lower place. Because it's actually true, isn't it? Their sin did bring the day of the Lord. Because this is how it works with God. No one has merit to receive God's salvation. Whether you are an ethnic descendant of Abraham or whether you are not. There's no merit that you ever have with God so that you would receive the blessing of his salvation. But God has declared promises of redemptive blessing. And the reason that they are going to receive this particular place after the day of the Lord judgment brings the day of the Lord salvation is simply because God has made promises to Abraham, because it will be through Abraham's offspring that who is going to be blessed? All the nations of the earth. The day of the Lord in its completion, after its judgment, and then with its completed salvation, brings about this ultimate fulfillment where indeed the Abrahamic covenant promises have been completed. That doesn't eradicate distinctions, as we see it in Zephaniah, between the nations whom God has saved, and then those from the remnant of Jerusalem and Judah and Israel that God has saved. The distinctions remain, and yet they are still a part of the saving work of God in the completion of the day of the Lord. And the reason it works that way is because God's just made promises this way. And God keeps his promises. So I think this does have some wrestling points for you, Christian. Number one, we've talked about this before. There's sort of three main categories that people interpret, Christians interpret particular points that deal with the nations being saved and descendants of Abraham being saved, and having this future final arrangement of all of them together, enjoying the redemptive blessings of God, and they're still kind of distinguished. So here's your choices. You can look at what is promised here to happen in the future, and you can sort of collapse it on one another, such that all of the promises that are explicit here for Israel, for Judah, you collapse that to be only referring to the church, which is a little bit, I'll just say, it's a little bit of a challenge for me, because we've got the nations as a separate group that is also enjoying the saving work of God on the day of the Lord. So I think there's some tension there, but that's one of the things that Christians will do because of certain New Testament passages. So you can collapse this into one group that doesn't have any distinction between Jew and Gentile. That's one choice. And many of my heroes do some kind of version of that. You've got another choice. All right. The other choice is that you make a very, very hard division between the saving work of God for the nations and the saving work of God for Israel. And in that sense, yes, they both are brought into a saving relationship with God, but they're two different ways. I'm going to say that seems to be difficult to do, especially because it's clearly taught differently in the scriptures, both Old and New Testament. But I also would say, but both of these here are brought, whether nations or descendants of Abraham in the nation of Israel, they're brought to this position because of God's work in the day of the Lord. So the day of the Lord, both judgment and salvation, achieves for both Jew and Gentile this great end described in verse 20. So I find that to be a difficult conclusion. Or, and here's the third, you are able to say, and there's many different species of this, so there's a lot of different sort of varieties, is that you are able to have different ways in which there is a preservation in God's saving work, which is here in the framework of the day of the Lord, which is accomplished in Jesus, the ultimate seed of Abraham, but in such a way that it's not a full collapsing of distinctions between Jew and Gentile, but rather has a Gentile conversion and then accented by a grand conversion of Jews towards the end. Those are various sort of big picture conclusions, and people would in one sense want to say the first option is what covenant theologians do. That is what some covenant theologians do. The other option is what dispensational theologians do. That is what dispensational theologians do. The third option, I would just want you to say that there's a lot of distinctions. I mean, a lot of people who have theological distinctions that do some kind of version of the third. And so you, as a Bible reader, you're going to have to wrestle with these. I read Zephaniah and I cannot get past that there is going to be, as a result of the final completion of the day of the Lord, both judgment and salvation, that there is indeed in one saved people, both Jew and Gentile. But in the nature in which this salvation is brought to its application, there's this Jewish expression of the saved people of God. And there is also clearly a Gentile, such that I call one, like Luke does, the age of the Gentiles. And then I see one happening at the end of the period of the tribulation that brings about the fulfillment of a great ingathering of Jewish people. So that's how I find Zephaniah to sort of make me wrestle with some of these things. But many people have different conclusions, but we all have to wrestle with Zephaniah. So the day of the Lord is the main point of Zephaniah, the judgment of Israel and the nations, as well as the salvation of Israel and the nations. Janine, was your hand raised? Okay. Questions?
I was going to ask you about the olive tree then. Why is there's one tree?
Mhm.
Grafted in, there's not two, one.
True.
So, but I guess that's more referring to, like you're saying, the final culmination, we're all saved, we're all in heaven, fine.
This is where you would say, like, within the third, there's a lot of versions. So the version that I presently subscribe to, and I'm only trying to illustrate that there's versions. I think Tim has a different version. So Tim could give in. I refer to the people as the people of God. I think, Tim, you refer to them as Israel. So there are versions within the third solution that says that no, there's only one redeemed people of God. Some people would call it Israel. Some people would call it the church. Some people would call it the people of God. There's reasons that they have different names. So in that sense, I think that that God has the people of God who, theologically speaking, we'd say are the elect, that in the great culmination of God's redemptive plan in the Messiah, they are all brought to God through the Messiah the same way, same sacrifice, same faith, same spirit, but they retain the evidence of the promises made to Abraham, such that I am a son of Abraham because of my faith in the Messiah, his seed, but I am of the nations. Whereas Judy is a son of Abraham by faith in the seed who is the Messiah, but she is an ethnic descendant of Abraham by faith.
Why would Paul say he's broken down in his flesh the dividing hostility?
Because in the people of God, and he says in that same passage, is from the two, he's made one new man.
Right. So that's the church. The body of Christ is the church.
Yeah, so I would say the people of God, like in the way that I would use it, refers to who is the people of God in the time when the Sinaitic covenant was the only relationship that God's people had with him. That would be Israel. Who is the people of God now? The church. So people of God is a phrase that is used to be able to say God always has one people, but the one people of God has had different covenant relationships that were enacted at that time. So that if you were a part of the people of God during the Sinaitic covenant, you would relate to God according to that covenant. If you are a part of the people of God right now, how do you relate to God? Through the new covenant, through Jesus Christ. So that would be the way I parse it out. I think Tim has a little different way that he parses this out, and he says it's Israel. That today you are a part of Israel, and I'll let Tim explains it. And then I think, if I can be honest, and Jerry, you can maybe correct me, I think our covenantal theological framework brothers would say they would prefer the church. So especially older covenant theology would say, no, when we're reading in the old covenant people, in the Sinaitic covenant, that's the church. How? Yeah, I mean, I'd want to see where they would be called the church.
Called out.
Yeah, I mean, they indeed were called out by God to be holy as he is holy. So I would say that what do you find in all three of those versions? they're wrestling with the same realities. And so I think there's reasons, and I would just say I think they're at their most basic form, they're hermeneutical reasons for which one is more persuasive to you versus which one might be more persuasive to me. But we are able to see, and even as I'll even quote R.C. Sproul. He said that he has a future place for the Jews in God's saving plan. So everyone in that sense is wrestling with, what does the scripture say? Zephaniah clearly is saying the day of the Lord is going to bring God's judgment to all nations, including Israel. And God's day of the Lord salvation is going to save people from all nations, including Israel. So that's all I got. And I didn't keep my rededicated life. So y'all are dismissed. No.